Close your eyes and imagine stepping out of your warm, modern home, only to find yourself in a world where the streets reek of waste, the water you drink could kill you, and the doctor you visit might bleed you to death, where disease spreads. Like wildfire, justice is delivered with an axe, and every stranger you pass could be your executioner. This isn't a nightmare. This was everyday life in the Middle Ages, and the question isn't how long you'd last. It's whether you'd even make it past a single day. The Middle Ages, a term that covers nearly 1,000 years of European history, stretching roughly from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th. It was an age defined by kingdoms rising and falling, by plague and war, by faith and superstition, and by a struggle for survival that was unrelenting for the vast majority of people. Popular imagination often conjures images of noble knights in shining armor, courtly love in candlelit halls, and peasants living quaint but simple lives in the shadow of majestic castles. Yet this vision, repeated in novels and films, hides a reality that was far more brutal. The Middle Ages were not a golden dream of romance and chivalry, but an era in which survival itself was the greatest battle. For the average person, daily life was defined not by adventure or heroism, but by hardship. Europe's population was overwhelmingly rural. Around 90% of people lived as peasants, bound to the land as farmers, laborers, or serfs. Their world was one of subsistence, where each year's harvest determined whether a family lived in relative stability or starved in the long winter months. A bad crop could mean hunger, debt, or even death. The social structure of medieval Europe was rigid and unforgiving. At the very top stood monarchs, whose authority was often justified as being ordained by God. Beneath them were the nobility, dukes, counts, barons, and knights whose power rested on land ownership and military might. Land was the foundation of wealth and authority, and nobles granted portions of it to vassals in exchange for service, particularly in war. The clergy formed another powerful class. The Catholic Church was the central institution of medieval Europe, commanding immense influence, not only over spiritual life, but also politics, education, and culture. From the Pope in Rome to the local parish priest, the Church dictated the rhythm of daily existence through its calendar of feasts, fasts, and holy days. Its cathedrals towered over towns, and its doctrine shaped how people understood the world and their place in it. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the peasants, who made up the vast majority of society. Some were free farmers, but many more were serfs, legally tied to the land they worked. Serfs could not freely leave, marry, or inherit without their lord's permission. Their lives were dominated by agricultural labor, working long hours with rudimentary tools, their backs bent under the weight of obligation. They owed their lords rent, labor, or a portion of their crops, often leaving little for their own families. This system, known as feudalism, was not uniform across Europe, but its principles were widely present. A society structured by land, loyalty, and hierarchy. For the noble classes, life carried more privileges, but it was not free of danger. Castles provided protection, yet war, intrigue, and disease claimed lives regardless of status. Wealth offered better food, clothing, and shelter. But even kings could not escape the reach of plague or the hazards of primitive medicine. The myth of medieval romance and simplicity dissolves quickly when examined against the reality of daily life. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Waste was thrown into the streets of towns and villages. Water sources were often polluted. Famine struck regularly, particularly in the early 14th century, when Europe endured the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which killed millions. Violence was never far away. Bandits roamed roads, lords feuded over land, and armies frequently marched through, seizing supplies and leaving destruction behind. The shadow of disease hung constantly over the population. Epidemics swept through communities, most famously the Black Death of the mid-14th century, which wiped out an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population. Child mortality was staggering, with many families losing multiple children before they reached adulthood. Average life expectancy, dragged down by high infant mortality, hovered around the mid-30s. Against this backdrop, religion provided both comfort and fear. The Church promised salvation, but also taught that sin and divine punishment explained disasters. A poor harvest, a sudden illness, or a violent storm could be interpreted as evidence of God's anger or the work of the devil. People lived under constant pressure to conform to religious teachings, for both spiritual survival and social acceptance. The reality is stark. The Middle Ages were not an era most modern people would endure easily. Today we live with comforts unimaginable to the medieval mind: clean water at the turn of a tap, medical care that can cure infections once fatal, reliable food supplies, and legal systems that protect individual rights. In contrast, medieval life meant exposure to hunger, filth, violence, and disease as a daily norm. It is tempting to imagine that we, with our modern resilience, might adapt, but the truth is that the very things we take for granted, hygiene, medicine, reliable shelter, and even basic safety, did not exist in their world. A single infected wound, a single bad harvest, or a single false accusation could end a life. What we consider extraordinary misfortune today was often ordinary reality then. The Middle Ages produced cathedrals, universities, and enduring works of art and literature. But beneath those achievements lay a daily struggle for survival that shaped the lives of millions. And it is here, in this fragile, dangerous, and unforgiving world, that we must ask the question: if transported back in time, could we truly last even one day? For the vast majority of people in medieval Europe, life was not defined by battles or courtly intrigue, but by the relentless demands of survival. Day after day, from sunrise to sunset, the struggle for food, warmth, and shelter dictated every action. To understand why survival in this world was so difficult, it is necessary to look closely at the ordinary routines of medieval existence: the food people ate, the conditions they lived in, and the endless labor required to keep themselves alive. Bread formed the foundation of the medieval diet, but it was far from the soft, refined loaves familiar today. Grain was ground in mills that often used stone, which shed small particles into the flour. As a result, bread frequently contained fragments of grit or sand. Over time, this wore down teeth, causing painful dental problems and infections. For peasants, bread was often dark, heavy, and coarse, made from rye, barley, or oats rather than wheat, which was expensive and reserved for wealthier households. Meat was not a daily staple for most people. Livestock was valuable and costly to maintain. When meat was eaten, it was often salted, smoked, or dried to preserve it. But without modern preservation methods, it frequently spoiled. Spices, when available, were sometimes used not only for flavor, but to disguise the taste of decay. For peasants, meals more often consisted of potager, thick stew of grains, beans, and vegetables, supplemented by whatever scraps of meat or herbs could be found. Water, the most basic necessity of life, carried its own risks. Wells and streams were easily contaminated by human and animal waste. In towns and cities, waste and runoff often flowed into the same rivers used for drinking water. This contamination spread diseases such as dysentery and cholera, which could decimate entire communities. Ale and beer, brewed at home or in local taverns, became the safer choice. Even children drank weak ale daily because the fermentation process killed some of the bacteria that made waters so dangerous. Famines were recurring threats. In the early 14th century, Europe endured the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Years of heavy rain ruined harvests, fields lay flooded, and grain reserves ran out. Starvation forced people to eat bark, roots, and even reports of animal carcasses left to rot. Chronic hunger weakened populations and left them vulnerable to disease. In such times, the thin line between life and death was determined almost entirely by the availability of food. Modern notions of hygiene were virtually non-existent. In villages, there were no toilets or sewage systems. People relieved themselves in ditches, fields, or communal pits. In towns, chamber pots were emptied into the streets, where waste mingled with mud and animal droppings. The stench of medieval cities was so notorious that chroniclers often remarked on it, describing London, Paris, and Florence as places where filth seemed to flow as freely as water. Bathing was infrequent. Public bathhouses did exist in some urban areas during the early Middle Ages, but concerns about morality, combined with outbreaks of disease, led to their decline. Most people washed rarely, if at all, often wiping themselves with a damp cloth or changing linen shirts when available. Fleas and lice were constant companions, spreading not only discomfort but deadly illness. Rats thrived in such conditions, and with them came the fleas that transmitted the bubonic plague in the 14th century. Medical understanding of cleanliness was almost entirely absent. The prevailing belief, rooted in the theory of the four humours, was that disease came from imbalances in the body or from miasma's foul airs, thought to rise from decay and filth. Without knowledge of bacteria or viruses, attempts at sanitation were ineffective. People burned herbs, carried posies of flowers, or wore amulets, but none of these practices could protect them from the epidemics that swept through their world. Housing for peasants was simple and often inadequate against the elements. The typical dwelling was a small, one-room hut built of wood, mud, or wattle and daub, with a thatched roof. Floors were usually bare earth. A central fire provided heat and a means to cook, but smoke filled the room because chimneys were rare until the later Middle Ages. Families and animals often shared the same space, increasing both noise and filth. In winter, cold drafts seeped through poorly sealed walls, and people huddled together for warmth. In summer, infestations of insects and vermin were common. Clothing was practical but crude. Wool was the primary fabric for peasants, spun and woven locally, and garments were rarely washed. In cold regions, layers of wool provided insulation. But dampness and poor drying meant clothing could be heavy and uncomfortable. Footwear was often limited to wooden clogs or simple leather shoes, offering little protection against the wet and cold. Only the wealthier classes could afford fine linen, silk, or brightly dyed fabrics, which served as clear indicators of status. For most, clothing was patched and repatched until it could no longer be used. The rhythm of daily life revolved around labor. For peasants tied to the land, Work began at first light and continued until sunset. Men, women, and children alike participated in the agricultural cycle, plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, and tending to animals. The work was backbreaking, and tools were basic wooden plows, iron-tipped hoes, and scythes. A poor harvest could bring ruin, but even in good years, the obligations to lords and the church left peasants with only a fraction of their produce. Feudal dues were exacted in many forms: labor on a lord's domain, payment of rents, or the surrender of crops. Tithes, typically 1/10 of produce, were owed to the church. After these obligations were met, what remained sustained the family often little more than enough to survive until the next harvest. The cycle left peasants perpetually vulnerable to shortages, with no safety net beyond the charity of neighbors or the church. For women, work was unending. In addition to field labor, they were responsible for grinding grain, baking bread, brewing ale, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and raising children. Childbirth itself was perilous, with high maternal mortality rates. Children were expected to contribute from an early age, tending animals, gathering firewood, or helping in the fields. Leisure was minimal, and even religious festivals, which provided rare moments of respite, often involved laborious preparations in towns. Life was different, but no less demanding. Craftsmen and merchants worked long hours, apprentices trained. For years, under strict guild systems, and markets were crowded, noisy, and unsanitary. The opportunity for upward mobility existed, but was rare, and poverty remained a defining feature of urban life to modern eyes. The conditions of medieval daily life seem almost unimaginable. The food was coarse, the water unsafe, the air heavy, with smoke and stench. Houses were cramped, cold, and infested. Clothing was rough and rarely clean. Work consumed nearly every waking hour, with little reward beyond survival itself. This was the daily grind of the Middle Ages, a ceaseless struggle against hunger, disease, cold, and exhaustion, while noble courts and cathedrals symbolized grandeur. The reality for the majority of Europe's population was a life spent battling the elements, the soil, and the limits of human endurance. In medieval Europe, law was rarely about fairness. It was about power, fear, and control. Justice was designed to be seen, to be heard, and to be remembered. It was a theater of violence, performed in public squares, marketplaces, and village crossroads. For the vast majority of people, punishment was not a private affair between the accused and the authorities. It was a spectacle, a lesson carved into flesh, a message that obedience was the only path to survival. Trials, when they were held, bore little resemblance to the legal protections we expect today. The concept of evidence was primitive, and guilt or innocence often depended less on facts than on oaths, reputation, or divine judgment. One of the most notorious methods was the trial by ordeal. For centuries across Europe, the accused were forced to submit to tests believed to reveal God's will. In ordeal by fire, a person might be ordered to carry a red-hot iron for several paces, or plunge their arm into boiling water. The wound was bandaged, and after several days it was examined by a priest. If it showed signs of healing, the accused was declared innocent, for God had supposedly intervened. If it festered, guilt was proven, and punishment followed. There was also ordeal by water. Bound and cast into a river, the accused faced a deadly paradox. If they sank, they were considered innocent, but many drowned before they could be pulled out. If they floated, water was said to reject them, a sign of guilt. Such rituals mixed law with superstition, turning the fate of a human being into a gamble with forces beyond their control. Though Pope Innocent III prohibited clergy from participating in ordeals in 1215, their legacy persisted for generations, a reminder of how fragile justice could be. For those found guilty, punishments were swift and often fatal. Execution was not hidden, await was deliberately public. Gallows stood at the entrances of towns, so that travellers and villagers alike would see bodies hanging as a warning. Hanging was common for thieves and murderers. More severe crimes, like treason, demanded punishments of unimaginable cruelty. In England, traitors could be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a process that began with partial hanging, followed by disembowelment while still alive, then decapitation and the division of the body into 4 parts. Heads were displayed on city gates, a gruesome reminder of the state's power. In France and the German states, breaking on the wheel was practiced. The condemned was tied to a cartwheel, and their limbs were shattered with an iron bar before being left to die slowly. Burning at the stake was inflicted not only on heretics and witches, but also on those accused of serious crimes against religion. Joan of Arc, condemned by an English-backed court in 1431, was executed in this way. Her death a political act masked as religious justice. Yet brutality was not reserved only for capital crimes. Even petty offences could bring humiliating and painful punishments. Stocks and pillories were common across Europe. Offenders were locked in wooden frames in the centre of towns, exposed to public ridicule, insults, and sometimes physical assault. From passers-by, a thief might be branded with hot irons, their hand cut off, or their ear sliced away. Whipping and flogging were everyday punishments, carried out before crowds to reinforce order. For many, survival after such penalties meant living with permanent scars, both physical and social. This system of justice reflected the values and anxieties of medieval society. Communities were tightly knit, and crime was seen not only as a violation of law but as a threat to stability. Fear of chaos, rebellion, or sin shaped the harshness of punishments. Authorities believed that only public, visible violence could prevent further disorder. Mercy was rare, and even when pardons were granted, they often served political purposes rather than compassion to a modern observer. Raised on the idea of rights, lawyers, and impartial courts, the medieval system is almost unrecognizable. Accused had few protections. Trials, if they occurred, might be little more than oaths sworn before a local lord, or confessions extracted under duress. Torture was widely accepted as a legitimate means of obtaining truth, from the strappado that dislocated shoulders to the rack that tore joints apart. The logic was simple. If the body broke under pain, the soul was revealing its guilt. The spectacle of justice was meant to shape behavior. Executions were festivals of fear, drawing entire communities. Chroniclers describe towns where thousands gathered to watch burnings or hangings. These events were not viewed as cruel excesses, but as moral lessons, reinforcing the divine and earthly order. Children were brought to watch. Priests delivered sermons beside the scaffold. The condemned were urged to confess publicly, turning their final words into tools of propaganda for the state or the church. The reach of this brutality extended beyond secular courts. The church wielded its own system of discipline through ecclesiastical courts, which dealt with cases of heresy, blasphemy, or moral offences. Here too, punishments could be severe, culminating in excommunication or execution. The Inquisition, beginning in the 12th century and expanding in later centuries, institutionalized this process, combining investigation with coercion to enforce religious orthodoxy. It is important to understand that this harsh system of law was not perceived as abnormal by those who lived within it. In a world of fragile order, frequent violence, and constant threat of rebellion or banditry, punishment had to be visible to be effective. Justice was not about fairness in the modern sense. It was about deterrence, spectacle, and control, too. The medieval mind, the suffering of one, was a lesson for all. For us today, the shock lies not only in the brutality of these punishments, but in their randomness. Guilt could hinge on rumor, on the testimony of a neighbor, or on the outcome of a ritual that defied reason. A modern person, accustomed to due process and legal protection, would be horrified by the absence of rights. In the Middle Ages, there was no guarantee of defense, no assumption of innocence, and no certainty that justice would mean truth. Survival meant not only avoiding crime, but avoiding accusation itself in the end. The brutality of law and order in the medieval world reveals the precarious balance of their society. Authority ruled through fear because fear worked. Justice was less about protecting the weak and more about demonstrating the strength of rulers, lords, and the church. It was a system that ensured obedience through violence and survival through silence. For the people of that time, justice was not a shield. It was a sword hanging constantly overhead. In the medieval world, life was fragile. A single cough, a small cut, or an unseen infection could spiral quickly into death. Modern medicine did not exist, and what passed for healing was a mix of superstition, limited knowledge, and desperate attempts to appease both God and the body. Illness was everywhere, and fear of it defined medieval life. The deadliest of all was plague. The Black Death, which swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351, remains one of the most catastrophic pandemics in recorded history. Carried by fleas on black rats and spread rapidly through trade routes, it killed an estimated 20 million people in Europe alone, nearly a third of the population. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities fell silent as corpses filled the streets. Chroniclers like Giovanni Boccaccio in Florence recorded scenes of such horror that survivors believed the world itself was ending. The plague returned in waves. For centuries, each outbreak rekindling terror that no prayer or treatment seemed able to halt. But plague was only one among many constant threats. Leprosy, a slow-moving bacterial infection, disfigured its victims and carried heavy stigma. Those afflicted were often cast out from communities and forced to live in isolation in leper houses on the edges of towns. The disease did not kill quickly, but its social consequences were devastating. To medieval minds, leprosy was seen not only as a physical ailment but as a spiritual punishment, reinforcing the belief that illness was tied to sin. Smallpox struck repeatedly, leaving survivors scarred for life if they were fortunate enough to live. Dysentery, spread through poor sanitation, could devastate armies and towns alike. Even the simplest wound, cut from a tool, a blister from a journey, or an animal bite could easily become infected. With no knowledge of bacteria or sterilization, infection often led to sepsis, gangrene, and death. To confront these constant dangers, medieval medicine turned to practices that were more ritual than remedy. Central to their understanding was the theory of the four humours, inherited from ancient Greek medicine through the writings of Galen and Hippocrates. The body, it was believed, was governed by the balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow. Bile illness came when one humor overwhelmed the others. Treatment, therefore, focused on restoring balance, often by removing fluids from the body. Bloodletting became one of the most common medical practices. Physicians used lancets to open veins or placed leeches on the skin, believing that draining blood would relieve fever or infection. Records show that kings and peasants alike submitted to this procedure, even though it weakened the patient and often hastened death. Cupping, where heated cups were applied to the skin to draw blood to the surface, was also widespread. The intention was to purge illness, but in reality it offered little more than pain and further vulnerability. Astrology also shaped medical practice. Physicians consulted the stars before performing procedures, believing that the alignment of planets influenced the body's health. A treatment might be delayed or advanced depending on the zodiac. And many medical texts included elaborate charts tying illnesses to celestial movements. To us, it seems closer to fortune-telling than medicine, but in a world without microscopes or germ theory, it carried authority. Herbal remedies were more practical, though their effectiveness varied widely. Monasteries in particular cultivated gardens of medicinal plants, recording recipes that blended observation with belief. Willow bark, which contains a natural form of aspirin, was sometimes used to ease pain, though its true chemical properties were unknown. Garlic, honey, and vinegar found their way into countless cures. Yet just as often, bizarre and ineffective treatments were prescribed, such as powdered gemstones, animal parts, or charms worn around the neck to ward off evil. The outcome of illness was often grim. Average life expectancy in medieval Europe was shockingly low, hovering between 30 and 40 years. This figure was skewed downward by the extraordinarily high rate of infant and child mortality. In some regions, as many as 1 in 3 children did not survive past the age of 5. Mothers and fathers lived with the constant knowledge that sickness could take their children at any moment, leaving families in cycles of grief that became almost routine. Pregnancy and childbirth were among the most dangerous experiences a woman could face without antiseptics or an understanding of hygiene. Infection claimed countless lives during and after delivery. Midwives relied on tradition, prayer, and experience, but their success was limited. For many families, losing a mother or a newborn was not an extraordinary tragedy, but a common part of life. This constant proximity to death shaped medieval culture in profound ways. Cemeteries expanded rapidly, and plague pits swallowed the bodies of the dead when churches could no longer cope with the numbers. Art and literature reflected an obsession with mortality. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a recurring motif in paintings and carvings, showing skeletons leading kings, peasants, and clergy alike to the grave. It was a reminder that disease spared no one, and that earthly life was always uncertain. Religious explanations dominated the understanding of disease. Outbreaks were often seen as divine punishment for sin. Communities organized processions of flagellants, men who whipped themselves publicly in hopes of appeasing God's wrath. Prayers, pilgrimages, and relics were sought as remedies when medicine failed. In some cases, scapegoats were chosen. During the Black Death, Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells, leading to massacres across parts of Europe. Fear of illness could easily transform into violence, deepening the suffering of already vulnerable groups. And yet, despite the limitations, there were glimmers of progress. Scholars in the Islamic world preserved and expanded upon ancient medical knowledge, and their texts gradually made their way into Europe. Figures like Avicenna, whose canon of medicine influenced both East and West, provided more systematic approaches to diagnosis and treatment. Universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford began training physicians, though their reliance on classical authorities still restricted innovation. Slowly, the groundwork was being laid for the medical revolutions of later centuries. But for the ordinary medieval person, such advances were distant and abstract. Their reality was a life lived under constant threat from disease. Families, buried children, parents, and neighbors with heartbreaking frequency. The absence of reliable cures meant that fear was a constant companion, shaping decisions, rituals, and even faith itself. To live in the Middle Ages was to live in the shadow of death, a shadow that could fall with no warning, from causes as small as a scratch or as vast as a plague. In medieval Europe, nothing shaped daily life more than religion. The Church was not merely a spiritual institution, but the most powerful authority across the continent. From the humblest peasant to the mightiest king, all lived under its influence. Its bells marked the hours of work and prayer. Its priests mediated births, marriages, and deaths, and its courts judged sins as well as crimes. To live in the Middle Ages was to live in a world where salvation and damnation were constant concerns, and where the boundaries between faith, superstition, and fear blurred into one. The Church's reach was absolute because it held control over the ultimate question: what happened after death? Heaven and hell were not abstract concepts, but vivid realities preached from every pulpit. Medieval art, stained glass, and manuscripts depicted paradise with radiant saints, but hell with grotesque demons and eternal flames. For a population already plagued by disease, hunger, and violence, the terror of eternal damnation magnified every choice in life. Sin was everywhere, and confession, penance, and obedience to the Church offered the only hope of avoiding the fires of hell. This fear of the afterlife gave clergy enormous power. A bishop could excommunicate a ruler, cutting him off from the sacraments, and in doing so weaken his political legitimacy. Ordinary villagers, unable to read the Latin Bible for themselves, depended entirely on priests to explain God's will. The Church collected tithes, roughly a tenth of every household's income, and demanded offerings for baptisms, funerals, and masses for the dead. Faith was genuine, but obligation was enforced, and refusal risked not only spiritual peril but also social ruin. Alongside official doctrine thrived a dense web of superstitions. Medicine itself was guided by religious and mystical thinking. Illness was often believed to be a punishment from God or an affliction caused by demonic forces. Amulets containing verses of scripture or relics of saints were carried as protection. Farmers planted and harvested according to the feast days of saints or the phases of the moon. Soldiers went into battle under banners believed to hold divine power, convinced that victory or defeat hinged not only on steel but on the will of heaven. Witchcraft and sorcery became ever-present fears, though the intensity varied across centuries. In the earlier medieval period, church authorities were skeptical of witch hunts, regarding belief in magical powers as superstition. But by the late Middle Ages, fear of witches grew dramatically. Texts such as the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, described witches as agents of the devil, accused of causing plagues, storms, or failed harvests. Across Europe, accusations led to interrogations, torture, and executions. Women, especially those who lived on the margins of society, were the most frequent targets. Fear of hidden, invisible enemies fed a culture where neighbors distrusted one another, and communities could quickly turn violent. Demons, too, were thought to be active in daily life. Stories of possession circulated widely, and priests performed exorcisms using holy water, prayers, and relics. Every misfortune could be traced to invisible causes. A poor harvest might be blamed on sin or sorcery. A sudden illness could be seen as the devil's work. Even natural disasters such as earthquakes or floods were interpreted as divine punishment for the collective failings of a community. This way of thinking was not confined to peasants. Kings, nobles, and even learned scholars sought omens, consulted astrologers, and turned to relics or prayers before making decisions of war or diplomacy. The emotional grip of this worldview was profound. People lived in constant tension, not only fearing disease, poverty, and war, but also the unseen weight of sin. An impure thought, a missed mass, or a failure to pay dues to the church could be interpreted as opening the door to eternal torment. Confession was both a relief and a reminder of guilt. Pilgrimages to holy sites such as Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury were undertaken as acts of penance, with travelers braving dangerous journeys in hopes of forgiveness. Relics of saints became objects of obsession. A fragment of bone, a piece of cloth, or even a vial of blood claimed to belong to a martyr or apostle was believed to carry miraculous power. Cathedrals competed to attract pilgrims by displaying the most prestigious relics, and the faithful offered money, prayers, and devotion in return for the promise of healing or protection. Whether genuine or forged, relics reinforced the central message that the sacred was always present, and that ordinary life was surrounded by the supernatural. For the modern mind, accustomed to science and secular law, such a world is almost unimaginable. But for medieval people, it was reality. They lived every day with the knowledge that invisible forces determined their fate, that God and the devil were active in every event, and that their eternal destiny hinged on obedience, faith, and ritual. In a time when death was always near, the fear of sin and damnation was often greater than the fear of hunger or disease. It was this mixture of faith and fear, of religion and superstition, that defined the medieval worldview. The Church offered hope of salvation, but also wielded fear of hell. Superstitions filled the gaps where knowledge was absent. And for the people of the Middle Ages, survival was not just about enduring the physical hardships of their world, but about navigating the invisible dangers of sin, demons, and divine judgment. In the medieval world, violence was not an exception. It was a constant presence, shaping the rhythms of life for centuries. From the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the closing years of the Middle Ages, Europe was rarely at peace. Kings, nobles, and warlords fought over land, wealth, and power, and ordinary people were the ones who suffered the consequences. Wars erupted with little warning. Territorial disputes between lords could transform into sieges and raids that destroyed entire regions. In England, the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century turned the countryside into a battleground, as rival dynasties tore the kingdom apart. Earlier, during the 100 Years' War between England and France from 1337 to 1453, campaigns brought devastation year after year. For peasants, the difference between a poor harvest and outright famine could be whether soldiers marched through their fields Armies lived off the land, seizing grain, livestock, and shelter. Villagers unlucky enough to lie in the path of war were often burned to the ground. Even in times of so-called peace, the countryside was dangerous. Bandits roamed the roads, preying on travelers and merchants. In some cases, disbanded soldiers and mercenaries became freebooters, drifting from one conflict to the next and turning to theft and violence between wars. In the wake of the 100 Years' War, bands of unemployed mercenaries, known as routiers, terrorized rural France, looting villages and demanding tribute. The weak enforcement of law outside towns meant that common people had little protection. Knights, often celebrated in later literature as noble defenders of the weak, were in reality more complex and frequently ruthless. While the chivalric code emphasized honor, loyalty, and the defense of the church, many knights acted as brutal enforcers for their lords. They collected taxes, imposed authority, and participated in raiding expeditions. Chronicles record knights engaging in plunder and brutality against peasants during campaigns. The romantic image of tournaments and courtly love was a narrow slice of knightly life, far removed from the daily violence of feudal enforcement. For those who lived in villages, the approach of armed men meant terror. A levy could drag peasants into service, forcing them to fight with little training and poor equipment. Others were left behind to endure the pillaging of crops, the torching of homes, and the abduction of livestock. Women were especially vulnerable, facing violence and exploitation in the chaos of raids. Entire communities sometimes fled to forests or hillsides, abandoning their homes at the first sight of approaching soldiers. Castles offered a very different experience of war. For nobles, these stone fortresses were both residences and military strongholds. Inside their walls, lords and their families were better protected from raids, though life in a besieged castle could still be grim. Food supplies ran low, disease spread quickly in cramped quarters, and siege engines battered walls for weeks or months at a time. Outside the castle walls, peasants bore the brunt of destruction, while inside, the elite clung to their power behind battlements. The brutality of medieval warfare was magnified by the weapons and tactics of the time. Siege warfare dominated, with trebuchets hurling stones to smash walls, and sappers digging tunnels to collapse defenses. Once walls were breached, massacres were common. The sack of Béziers in 1209 during the Albigensian Crusade saw thousands of inhabitants slaughtered. When the city fell, at the siege of Jerusalem in 1099 during the First Crusade, crusading armies killed Muslims and Jews in such numbers that chroniclers claimed the streets ran with blood. These events were not isolated. They reflected the accepted practices of war, where mercy was rare and terror was deliberate. Conscription also weighed heavily on medieval societies. Lords had the right to demand military service from their vassals, who in turn called upon their peasants. For common men, service meant leaving behind families and farms for months, sometimes years. Poorly armed and untrained, many did not return. Wars thinned the population not only through combat but through famine, disease, and displacement. The very presence of armies, whether friend or foe, meant hardship for civilians. Religious wars added another layer to the violence. The Crusades, spanning from the late 11th to the 13th centuries, drew tens of thousands of Europeans into campaigns in the Holy Land. While inspired by spiritual ideals of reclaiming sacred sites, the reality was brutal. Entire populations were uprooted, and conflict spilled back into Europe itself. The same spirit of holy war fueled campaigns against heretics and pagans within the continent, such as the Northern Crusades in the Baltic and the campaigns against the Cathars in southern France. In each case, war was justified not only as politics, but as divine will, sanctifying bloodshed. The ordinary medieval person lived with the knowledge that violence could arrive at any moment, whether from distant wars or local feuds. Villages rebuilt again and again after raids. Families lived with the constant possibility of conscription or loss, even in times of apparent peace. The shadow of war never fully disappeared. For the modern world, accustomed to standing armies, police forces, and legal protections, the medieval reality is almost unimaginable. Violence was not something distant, confined to borders or professional soldiers. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, from the fields of peasants to the halls of kings. To survive in such a world meant living always on edge, prepared to lose everything in a single raid, siege, or campaign. In the medieval world, most lives went unrecorded. Chronicles preserved the deeds of kings, nobles, and churchmen. But the overwhelming majority of people, women, children, and peasants passed through history without leaving names or voices. Yet it was they who bore the weight of medieval society, working, suffering, and enduring conditions that few today could imagine. For women, life was defined by constraint. Their roles were shaped by law, religion, and custom, leaving little room for independence. In noble families, marriages were arranged to secure alliances, wealth, or land. A daughter's future was rarely her own choice. Once married, she was expected to manage a household, bear children, and serve the interests of her husband's family. Among peasants, the pattern was no less rigid. Women labored in the fields alongside men, cared for children, and maintained homes with minimal resources. Childbirth was among the greatest dangers women faced. Without understanding of infection or access to safe medical practices, the risk of death in labor was high. Midwives provided assistance, often relying on traditional remedies and prayers, but complications frequently proved fatal. Even survival did not guarantee health. Many women endured chronic injuries from repeated pregnancies. With large families, common and infant mortality staggering, women lived with the constant burden of both risk and grief. Their legal rights were sharply limited. In most regions of medieval Europe, women could not inherit property on equal terms with men, testify freely in courts, or exercise political power. Exceptions existed. Powerful queens, like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Isabella of Castile, demonstrated what was possible at the highest levels, but these women were rare. For the vast majority, influence was confined to the domestic sphere, and even there it was bounded by obedience to male authority. Children, too, lived under harsh realities. In modern times, childhood is seen as a time of play and learning. In the Middle Ages, it was a brief and fragile stage before work. From the age of 7, peasant children were expected to contribute to farming tasks, tending animals, gathering firewood, or assisting in household labor. In noble families, boys began training for knighthood at a similar age, serving as pages before advancing to squires. Their education emphasized obedience, physical training, and preparation for war. Girls were groomed for marriage, their instruction centered on domestic skills and piety. Play was not entirely absent. Archaeological finds reveal simple toys, such as wooden dolls, balls, and miniature weapons, but leisure was scarce. Survival demanded labor, and the high mortality rate meant that many children never reached adulthood. In some regions, as many as 1 in 3 children died before the age of 5, victims of disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Parents faced the constant heartbreak of loss, shaping family life with an undercurrent of uncertainty that is difficult to comprehend today. Beyond women and children lay the largest group of all, the peasants bound to the land, the serfs. They formed the backbone of medieval society, producing the food and resources on which everyone else depended. Yet their lives were circumscribed by poverty and obligation. Most were tied to a lord's estate, required to work the fields not only for their own survival, but to provide rents, taxes, and services to their masters. Few serfs traveled beyond the boundaries of their village. For many, the horizon of their world was only a few miles wide. Bound to the land by custom and law, they had little opportunity for mobility. Their homes were simple structures of wood and thatch, often shared with animals for warmth. Diets were basic, relying heavily on coarse bread, porridge, and seasonal vegetables. Meat was rare, reserved largely for festivals or for those with means. Their labor was unrelenting. From dawn until dusk, they worked in fields, tended livestock, repaired tools, and paid dues in both crops and labor. Even in times of famine or poor harvest, obligations to lords and the church rarely diminished. The cycle of sowing, growing, and harvesting dominated existence, leaving little space for rest or personal ambition. What makes this vast majority truly forgotten is the absence of their stories. Chronicles did not record their names, except when they appeared as part of rebellions, disasters, or unusual events. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 briefly illuminated the anger of the common people, who rose against heavy taxation and oppression. But such moments were exceptional. Most lived and died without written record, their struggles swallowed by the silence of history. Despite the hardships, these lives were essential. Without women maintaining households, without children entering work at an early age, without peasants providing the labor that sustained manors and kingdoms, medieval society could not have functioned. Yet their invisibility in written history means that modern perceptions of the Middle Ages often overlook the very people who made survival possible. To step into their world is to confront a reality where life was short. Options were narrow, and the future was uncertain. Women risked death in childbirth, children faced labor before maturity, and peasants endured lives of grinding toil. They were the forgotten majority, nameless in chronicles, but indispensable to the fabric of their time. Their silence in the historical record speaks volumes about the harsh inequalities of medieval life, and reminds us that for most, survival itself was the only legacy. The castles of medieval Europe projected an image of strength and security. Behind their stone walls, nobles dined on rich food, dressed in fine fabrics, and surrounded themselves with servants. To the struggling peasantry outside, their lives must have seemed enviable, even untouchable. But the reality of noble life was far more fragile. Comfort did not guarantee safety, and privilege often carried its own hidden dangers. Politics was among the deadliest hazards of noble life. In a world where power rested on land, alliances, and bloodlines, ambition often turned family against family. The courts of Europe were riddled with intrigue. Poisoning became a weapon of choice when open violence was too risky. Chronicles from Italy, France, and Byzantium recount the sudden and suspicious deaths of princes, dukes, and bishops. At the papal court in Rome, Rumors of poisoned chalices and assassinated rivals were constant. Even kings were not immune. In 1216, King John of England, long remembered as one of the realm's most unpopular monarchs, died suddenly during a campaign. Though contemporary accounts cite dysentery, whispers of poison persisted. Court politics carried an unrelenting pressure. A nobleman who rose high in favor could fall just as quickly to accusations, betrayal, or shifting allegiances. The fate of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, is one of the starkest examples. Once a close ally of King Henry II, Becket's defense of the church against royal encroachment led to his murder by knights. Loyal to the crown in 1170, his death shocked Europe, but it revealed the ever-present risks of navigating between loyalty and survival, even in times of peace. The trappings of luxury could prove perilous. Feasts filled noble halls with roasted meats, pies, and exotic spices imported from distant lands. Yet food preservation was poor, and kitchens often lacked knowledge of contamination. Dishes could be spoiled without detection, leading to outbreaks of food poisoning. Alcohol flowed freely, dulling senses and inflaming tempers, sometimes turning celebrations into violence. The very extravagance that defined noble life carried the seeds of sickness and danger. Leisure, too, was laced with risk. Hunting was one of the great pastimes of the nobility, a marker of status and skill, but it was also a deadly pursuit. Mounted hunts through forests and fields led to falls, trampling, and fatal goring by wild animals. In 1100, King William II of England, known as William Rufus, was killed by an arrow while hunting in the New Forest. Officially declared an accident, the death was immediately surrounded by suspicions of assassination, as his younger brother Henry seized the throne. Within days, tournaments and jousts, celebrated as displays of knightly valor, were no less dangerous. Combatants charged at each other with heavy lances, and even with blunted weapons, injuries were common. Fatalities were not rare. In 1559, the French king Henry II was killed in a joust when a lance splintered and drove through his eye. Though far removed from the average knight, his death symbolized how even rulers were not shielded from the risks of their own entertainments. The mental burden of power weighed heavily on nobles as well. Authority brought constant vigilance. Every decision risked making new enemies, whether in the form of rival families, rebellious vassals, or foreign monarchs. Alliances made through marriage could shift into threats within a generation. Trust was scarce, and suspicion often dictated survival. Many rulers lived in fear of assassination, surrounding themselves with guards and fortifications, yet often falling to betrayal from within their own courts. The Byzantine Empire provides countless examples. Emperors were routinely overthrown, blinded, or killed by ambitious rivals, sometimes from their own kin. In Western Europe, too, violence at the highest level of power was frequent. In Scotland, James I was assassinated in 1437 by conspirators within his own household. The very act of ruling demanded an acceptance of mortal danger. For noble women, comfort was equally deceptive. Queens and duchesses might wear jewels and sit at banquets, but their fates were bound to dynastic politics. Marriage alliances could wrench them across continents, placing them in foreign courts where hostility and isolation were constant. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France in the 16th century, became infamous for her political maneuvering, yet much of her life was spent fending off plots against her children and her own reputation. Even at the highest rank, women remained vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft, infidelity, or treachery charges that could strip them of security in an instant. The illusion of noble comfort is perhaps best understood by comparing the visible and invisible. Castles promised security with their walls and towers, but they were also cold, damp, and unhealthy. Smoke from hearths blackened the air, water supplies could be contaminated, and disease spread easily in close quarters. Political alliances brought wealth and influence, but also the constant risk of betrayal. Feasts and entertainments filled the halls with splendor, but behind every banquet and every hunt lurked the possibility of sudden death. Privilege gave the nobility access to power, wealth, and luxury, but it never freed them from the dangers of their age. If anything, it magnified them. To rise higher meant to have farther to fall. To rule meant to live every day under the shadow of ambition, envy, and violence. The peasants in the fields might have suffered more visibly, but for the nobility, life at the top was no less uncertain. Comfort, in the Middle Ages, was an illusion one that could vanish in an instant. Modern life shields us in ways we rarely recognize. Clean water flows from taps. Medicine waits in pharmacies. Laws protect us from violence, and governments provide a framework of stability. The Middle Ages had none of these assurances. A single step into that world, and the differences become overwhelming. Consider hygiene. Today, soap, showers, and sterilized bathrooms are ordinary. In medieval towns, waste was tossed into open streets, where it mixed with mud, animals, and rotting refuse. Fleas and lice were constant companions, and outbreaks of disease followed wherever sanitation failed. The plague of the 14th century spread with devastating speed in this environment, killing between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. A modern person accustomed to germ theory and personal space would face a constant assault on their senses and their health. Food and water tell a similar story. Our diets today are varied, nutritious, and regulated by standards that reduce the risk of contamination. In the Middle Ages, grain was often bulked out with sand or ground husks, wearing down teeth with every bite. Meat, when it could be afforded, was salted, smoked, or spiced to mask spoilage. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries, not everyday staples. Water was frequently unsafe, driving many to drink weak beer or wine instead. What seems like basic survival for us would have been a daily struggle against hunger, malnutrition, and poisoning for them. Law and order in the modern world means rights, trials, and protections against cruel punishment. In the Middle Ages, justice was immediate and brutal. A theft might result in a hand cut off. Insolence could land someone in the stocks, exposed to ridicule and abuse. Accusations of serious crimes often led to trial by ordeal, plunging a hand into boiling water, walking across hot irons, or being thrown into rivers, with survival interpreted as divine judgment. Executions were public spectacles, intended to terrify as much as to punish. For people raised in societies that value individual rights, the arbitrary and violent nature of medieval justice would be intolerable. Medicine illustrates another vast gulf. Modern hospitals offer antibiotics, surgery, and vaccines. Medieval healing relied on bloodletting, herbal remedies of uncertain value, and astrology. Infections from minor wounds, now treated with a simple course of antibiotics, could kill within days. Diseases like smallpox, leprosy, and dysentery ran unchecked, and parents faced the near certainty of losing children. In some regions, 1 in 3 infants did not survive past their first year. To live in the Middle Ages meant living with grief as a permanent companion. The psychological weight of this existence is difficult for us to imagine. Every winter threatened famine. Every cough could signal a deadly illness. War, banditry, and raids lurked beyond the horizon. The Church warned of damnation for sins both known and unseen, while superstition made even daily routines subject to unseen forces. Fear, grief, and uncertainty shaped every life. A modern person accustomed to comfort, safety, and medical care would find the mental strain unbearable. Yet medieval people endured. They developed resilience forged by necessity. Hardship was expected, not exceptional. Death was not hidden in hospitals, but confronted openly in villages, churches, and homes. Faith, community, and tradition provided strength where modern society would falter. Their ability to labor from dawn to dusk, to endure pain without anesthesia, and to survive on limited resources reflects an adaptation that most of us lack. It is tempting to look back on the Middle Ages with pity, but survival required a toughness that modern life has largely erased. We live longer, healthier, and safer lives, but we have also grown dependent on the protections our systems provide. Without them, our fragility would be exposed. The truth is that the men and women of the medieval world, from peasants to nobles, lived in conditions most of us would not survive for long. They faced disease, violence, hunger, and grief with a resilience that deserves respect. Their endurance built the foundations of the world we now inhabit. But step into their world for even a single day, and the illusion of modern toughness would shatter. Admire their strength, acknowledge their suffering, but accept the truth. Most of us sheltered by medicine, law, and comfort would not last a day in the Middle Ages for 1,000 years. Men, women, and children endured a world shaped by hardship. Their lives were short, their struggles relentless, yet they persisted. From the ashes of the Roman Empire to the dawn of the Renaissance, generation after generation carried on ploughing the fields, raising families, fighting wars, and building the foundations of the societies we now call home. The contrast with our own lives is impossible to ignore. We enjoy medicine that defeats diseases which once wiped out entire towns. We eat fresh food delivered across oceans. We turn a tap for clean water and a switch for light. Where they faced famine, plague, and violence as constants, we treat them as rare exceptions. Yet their resilience was extraordinary. Without antibiotics, they endured infections. Without central heating, they survived bitter winters. Without legal protections, they bore the weight of brutal justice. Their faith, their communities, and their sheer willpower allowed them to withstand a world that would crush most of us in days. It is easy to dismiss the Middle Ages as a dark and backward time, but it was also an age of survival, an age that demanded strength, sacrifice, and a daily confrontation with mortality. In enduring it, they created the cultural, religious, and political structures that would one day allow modern civilization to flourish. So the question remains, if you were stripped of every modern comfort, if you were placed in a medieval village, forced to eat their food, drink their water, and face their justice, would you emerge stronger, tempered by struggle? Or would the weight of disease, hunger, and fear break you completely before a single day had passed?